Hello. This is Ethan Davidson. I have not made a video here or anywhere for a while, and I don't remember what number this is, so I shall add that later. Hello. I'm confused, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, where I left off, as I recall, I was 16. It was 1978/1979, and I am living on the Sausalito houseboats. Basically, okay, it's 78. I'm going to make it be 1978 before I moved to Japan. But basically, I've talked a lot about some of the characters that I lived with and hung out with on the houseboats of Sausalito, but not all of them. So I'm going to continue to describe some more of them, and then we will see what else I want to talk about. Yes, I've lost a tooth. Okay. So basically, I've talked a lot about this, and I don't want to be too repetitive, but this was an area in Sausalito. It was low-income people. It was a very eclectic group of people, hippies, artists, writers, some, not to mention just basically drug addicts and alcoholics and that sort of people. Mostly white, not 100%, but mostly white. And they lived on various things, these very big old wooden ferry boats. They were so old, they still had steam engines. People lived and worked in those. They worked in little boats, little like hobo, little hippie shacks that floated on water. And some of them lived in real boats. Some of them are ships. Some of them lived out, not even attached to the bed, to the land. They had to row back and forth. So this is the scenario we were talking about. Some of the little boats were on land. Some of them floated. They were connected by wooden pathways. Okay, I've already described a lot of that. So let me get into some of the other characters before I move on to the very early San Francisco punk scene. Okay, so there was one guy. A lot of these people are dead, and so I'm going to use their real, not their real names, but their real nicknames for the most part. And these are people I haven't talked about before, as far as I can remember. So there was one guy named Michael Woodstock. I took Spanish from him when I was 9 at the free school they had there, about 9 or 11 or something. Anyway, I taught Spanish from him, but I kept losing my list of verbs and conjugation and whatnot. So he stopped bothering, and we just hung out and talked about comic books. He moved from a houseboat to an anchor out. He was a pretty big seller, I think, of psychedelics. So he sold a lot of LSD in his day. And then later mescaline, which I tried a little bit of that. Yeah, so he was my Spanish teacher. He eventually was found dead in Mexico. So I guess he spoke Spanish. The weird thing is that he still had the money and the LSD in his pocket, which means that robbery must not have been the motive, unless it was done very poorly, but his stuff was still on him. So why somebody chose to kill him down there? I don't know. Sad story. He was a pretty nice guy. I don't remember him like being one of the really shady gangsters. There were gangster types down there, but he or or sleazeballs. I never remember being him being in that category. Okay, so the next thing, I'm remembering a guy by the name of Burnt Tom. Why do you think he was called Burnt Tom? Basically, in this community where pretty much everybody used drugs, almost not everybody, the great majority of people use drugs and or alcohol, and plenty of it. He was known as being burnt, as in burnt out. So he kind of identified as a Rastafarian and thought he had dreadlocks, but he really didn't. He had what I call bum locks, which means, dreadlocks don't happen by themselves. I know, I tried to grow some. It's not enough to just not do anything with your hair. You have to separate them into these locks. He did not do that. So what he got instead was this big coagulated carpet of long hair. He lived with he lived in a little boat. He did a lot of meth, I think, was his main thing. He also, he smoked weed, obviously. And he had done a lot of Michael Woodstock's LSD, he said. And he used barbiturates sometimes, whatever. And so he had a reputation for just basically having a fried out brain. And it took a high standard of fried outedness to attain that status in that neighborhood, in that general area. He was into Satanism sometimes, I think. At one point we were sitting around the campfire, as we did. Each neighborhood has its own little communal fire that we hang out around. And he said something along the lines of, "I'm not afraid of fire. I'm the master of fire. I rule fire." And another woman said, "Oh, Tom, are you on your Satanism trip again?" So there was that. And he lived in a houseboat, but it wasn't a houseboat. I take that back. He lived in a small boat. And for a while, he did date a young woman who was about the same age as me. We were contemporaries. In fact, once when we were little kids, she had, as soon as the adults left, she started picking on me for no apparent reason. But that is no reason for me to be happy, and I'm definitely not, about what happened to her afterwards. She started living with and dating Burnt Tom, and the woman I was staying with, I was living at some point with an older woman. She was letting me, crash with her. Very nice of her. Her initials were MW, for those who may have known her. She's gone now. Anyways, she was saying, yeah, Dolly was okay before she started living with Tom. But after that, after living with him, that's when she really started having a screw loose. I think that was true, and it's probably because of drugs she did while living with him. Did the drugs with him, and I think I mentioned, oh yeah, he's kind of into Satanism, and she said, yeah, I know, and I wouldn't be surprised. She said, I bet that his soul is locked in the deepest vault of hell, and I wouldn't be surprised if he had taken Dolly's soul with him. Okay, I don't believe in that kind of thinking. He wasn't that bad. Yeah, he gave her drugs, but she probably consented to it. I don't think she put all the blame on him for her getting kind of burnt out herself. There are worse people to belong in the deepest vaults of hell, if there are any such thing, which I don't believe there are. Okay, that's a tangent. There was another guy. He was known as the bee junkie. Now, this guy was gone, like decompensated schizophrenic, kind of gone. Not the only one living there. And he earned the name the bee junkie because apparently he had been observed putting bees or yellow jackets or something like that onto his arm and then smashing these little critters with his hand so that, of course, they stung his arm. And that earned him the moniker the bee junkie. There's nothing good in those bees that makes you want to feel good when you do that. I tell you. Anyway, he panhandled and he always asked for 63 cents. My father observed this. It was always exactly 63 cents. Why? I don't know. You know, some panhandlers will ask for a very specific amount like that because it makes them sound like that's all they need and they just need exactly 63 cents. Of course, that wasn't the case. And since everybody knew him, I'm sure they knew that it was always 63 cents with him. Who knows what goes on in the minds of people like that? There was another guy who was also schizophrenic, not to the same degree. He lived in one of the wooden ferry boats, but he didn't have even a room. He just there was this area within the structure of the ship, and it wasn't a room, but it was a little nest he made there. And he was a pretty nice guy. Definitely mentally incapacitated, and I guess he took LSD from time to time, which probably didn't help. So those are some of the characters. And then I've already talked about Maria, the Puerto Rican sex worker lady that I spent some time with. And so now, as it happened, and I've talked about this a bit, there was this whole political situation happening where they were trying to gentrify the area, and people were sitting in front of bulldozers and so forth and so forth. And I was involved with that as early as 77 before I went to Belize. And then it was still happening when I got back. And so I went to a meeting of the Waterfront Protection Association. They had been doing civil disobedience of various sorts, which I had participated in a little, much as they let me. So somebody told me that he had a trailer, and the trailer was located right next to the paved parking lot. So basically, it was kind of on the border of where they were likely to want to haul it away to proceed with the gentrification and to cover the unpaved areas up with concrete instead of the dust and mud that we preferred, because it made us actually be a place to be instead of just a place to park a car and walk to and fro another place to be, if you follow. Yeah, for example, there was another fire pit there. Anywho, he wanted somebody to live in it so that it would to decrease the odds of it getting towed. So I volunteered, and hence I got 50% of the trailer, because his stuff was stored on the other side, as a rent for free. So that was cool. I believe my father lived on the houseboat at that time too. So I set about furnishing it, and there was just a short distance away, easy walking distance from our mostly white poverty pocket on the houseboats, was the black poverty pocket, where there was a project, and that was Marin City. Very close, seldom mingled. But on weekends, there was a big empty dirt lot that turned into a flea market. And this was perfect for me. So I bought a little folding bed, and I bought I bought a styrofoam cooler that was could be ice in it, providing me with the closest thing I had to a refrigerator. And I bought a little record player and some kind of radio, I guess, and um, and some records. Most of these things I purchased at the flea market, so it was useful for me, affordable. Now, Maria happened to be dating this guy. The earliest punk, well, the first punk I ever met, and then the second were these teenage girls that went to high school with me. That is how I found out. Well, I knew in the abstract, but those were the first actual punks I met. And one of them explained it to me how there are these clubs you can go to, clubs as in nightclubs. In that case, it was the Mabuhay Gardens, yeah. And so I got into that. And, you know, I mean, the whole goal, at least for me, being raised by hippies, and growing up around hippies was to be even weirder, to take the weirdness concept even a step farther. And so, we listened to louder, angrier music, theoretically, and dressed more outrageously, and so forth. Um, but a lot of what we did wasn't that different from what the hippies had done, especially a little later when it became less about groovy. Yeah, that was the main difference. Like the groovy, mellow optimism stuff was tossed out for a more pessimistic, if not nihilistic perspective, which was logical because we had been small children during the optimistic period. But then, as we became a little older, we saw the downfall. We saw and heard of the downfall of all that. So we could really not believe in the dream much anymore. We were just in it to have fun and create havoc for no particular reason, really, although I thought there was a reason. The main reason was to push even further the boundaries of what was acceptable. That's how I saw it anyway. And that's how a lot of people saw it in the early days before punk became a bit reactionary itself, which didn't start until, maybe the early 80s, really. Not that far ahead, but it seemed so to me at the time. So, what? Um, yes, Maria the sex worker was dating a guy who went by the name of, I'm just going to say it, Jew. That's the name he chose. He was a genuine white supremacist in his days. He really did hold some racist beliefs. And that was the weird thing about the early punk scene. First of all, well, the people didn't all dress the same in the early days. Their music did not all sound the same. I was surprised looking back. Yeah, there were brass bands. There was one woman who just sang a cappella while beating a drum. It wasn't all three chords Ramones stuff. The Nuns would were more like the Velvet Underground. They would go from soft and soothing to three chord loud, and so on. And then later Flipper went the whole sludge rock and started going against the grain by playing super slow. So they were the type that would rebel even against their own subculture, which is one of the reasons it was unsustainable, which may be okay. But anywho, there was this guy Jew, and yes, I'm Jewish, but I at that time was going through my own little internalized anti-Semitism kind of rebellion. So I didn't, I whatever. I did what I did. Not that I ever had a full-blown fascistic or white supremacist ideology. I never really did. I just liked playing with it because, it was the kind of something that my parents definitely did not like. But what Juice sold at that time was like these little leather ornaments, basically useless little ornament. Like, for example, one that I bought was black leather, and there was something you snapped on your fingers, and there were all these silver studs, and I guess they sort of looked badass, except they really served no useful function whatsoever. They weren't gloves. They weren't like really didn't work very well as weapons or anything. But I bought one. I liked it. I wore one to a punk club once, and I was like holding my hand up, showing it, and somebody said, "Hey, if you want to pose, could you go to the back?" Because I was posing, and poser was and remained, and for some remains to this day, the worst insult in the punk community is to call someone a poser. But the funny thing is, we were all posers. We were all posing. Some of us lived it more than others, more often, so we were more hip to what the nuances of the moment of how we were, supposed to dress in order to not dress how we dressed last year or whatever. But we were pretty much all posers. So that is that. That's not that, but that'll do for now. So I am going to now accelerate to the punk thing. I established where I was living. Oh, yeah, my point was the people I was living with were just as weird, really. At least some of them were. We may have looked a little more weirder because we were newer, People didn't dye their hair green and purple and blue back then. Now, everybody does. But not back then. It got us attention and sometimes threats of violence. So we were attempting to push the boundaries of what was considered socially acceptable, normalized in terms of weirdness. That was certainly my message, my mission in life. But people like Burn Tom and Michael Woodstock and them, the Bee Junkie, they certainly were not slouches in the advanced weirdness department. So in those days, the Mabuhay Garden was happening. I found out where I was supposed to go. I started going. Jew went. Maria went. My friend from high school. Both of my female friends from high school that were punks were going. So yeah, that was cool. And so first it was definitely the Mabuhay, which is famous and operated for a long time. It was in the daytime, it was a Filipino restaurant. Mabuhay, I believe, means hello in Philippine Tagalog, right? So, and then at night, it just turned into this total weirdness. And, there were the punk bands. They were weird by the standards of the time. They were definitely weird and far more creative and diverse than what they became later, I gotta say. I gotta say. Not that I was necessarily listening, because I was just there to do drugs and pick up chicks to a large extent, but not really. I was there because I was curious and interested in the newness and exploring and pushing my personal boundaries and everybody else's. So the what were they called? The sexually explicit players? Or did they? No, they hadn't taken on. So there was this guy named Frank Moore, a performance artist. I met him later. He had some sort of severe disability that forced him to be in a wheelchair. he definitely had a speech impediment. He could not do all that much with his body by himself without help. He usually had a woman helping him. And I don't remember the exact name of his ailment. Some kind of spastic, or I don't know. He organized, well, first he organized, God, I'm drawing a blank. Anyway, it was this band that put on these bizarre theater acts. It wasn't really a band, and it wasn't really a skit comedy. It was sort of performance art, I guess, with a very dark comedic aura. I remember being there and seeing a scene in a hospital. It was just Frank Moore himself, this no joke, very disabled guy, and a woman playing his nurse. And so what happened was, in this play, like, the other people left the room and the nurse started torturing him while he started screaming, and it just basically, she was doing all this stuff, medical, and finally concluding with her giving him an enema while he was screaming. Now, to me, this just seemed, it seemed shocking and weird, but I didn't really get it like I do now, because I hadn't spent very much time in the hospital, but I have now. And he must have already spent a very medicalized life. So he must have experienced a lot of medical situations which felt like he was being non-consensually tortured by nurses, because boy, can it feel that way when you're in the hospital for really anything more than a day. Becomes nightmarish, as I've experienced it. And he must have been working through a lot of stuff. He wrote that. I mean, he created the show. He created the group. Somebody wrote a review. He said, okay, there's this group, and then there's this disabled guy, and like, does he really know what's going on? Is he being abused or exploited? And then it said, yes, he not only knows what's going on, he created it. He created the whole thing. Frank Moore, rest in peace. He later went on to do some other interesting performance art that involved nudity and getting people to touch each other and reading his poetry, and I guess it was poetry and some sort of mystical stuff, sort of tantric, like be erotic but don't get off kind of kind of stuff. Had a little fun at least one of those gatherings. Yeah. Okay, so there was that, and then there were the punks. And then there was, that wasn't the only place. There was this other name that was called the Geary Theater, some also known as the Temple Beautiful or the New Wave A Go-Go. That place had been a Jewish synagogue. It was very close to where Jim Jones's People's Temple had been quite recently. Like, maybe there was some crossover. It's still that whole area. It was on the Fillmore, and there were some, it was a black area. There were some hostile gangs around that beat some of us up. I got a nice black eye one evening, because I was too stupid when other people were being beaten up. It's like, what should I do? I should help them, but I know I can't really fight, and blah, blah. Maybe I should leave. And then I got a black eye, and I'm like, yeah, no, I probably should leave. Yeah. So I crossed the street and took the bus back to Sausalito. So that was one place. And there were some Rastafarians working there and so on. I went a number of times there, took a lot of drugs, etc. Wasn't around for that long. And then the most cutting edge, this is epic. This was the most cutting edge place, and you just can't imagine something like that happening in San Francisco these days. It was called the Deaf Club. And it was called that before the punks moved in because that's what it literally was. It was a social club for deaf people, like hearing impaired people. And so apparently one of them had gone in and written a note saying, I would like to use this place to book bands. How much would it cost per month? And the guy wrote a note back that said yes and $200. So that's what he did. He rented the place out for $200 a month and then had shows and charged small amounts of money for them. We had some pretty classic acts. We had Tuxedo Moon, and we had, oh God, I don't know who, as well as some purely crappy little acts, really. But I guess the punks liked it, and the deaf people liked it. So why did the deaf people like it? First of all, they couldn't hear much of it. Depending on how much they could hear, it either was much softer to them or they couldn't hear it at all. But it was visually interesting. So we dressed up in colorfully, hair dyed, just so forth and so forth. And they probably enjoyed that. And then in addition, they could, no doubt, the bass was strong enough that they could feel it through the floor. They could feel it vibrate. So they probably liked that too. So here were all these, hardcore 1978 era, 78, 79 era punks, um, hanging out, listening to the bands like No Alternative and Tuxedo Moon and Versus and the Dead Kennedys and uh, well, anyway. And then there were these deaf people just hanging out, grooving on the tunes. You could buy drinks there. In those days, it was not that difficult to buy alcohol when you were underage. Certainly not in San Francisco. I liked screwdrivers. They were like, I don't know, $2, $3, which was about the same price as it cost to get in the door. And they were strong. So I like that. Now, let me tell you a little story. First of all, I have to flash forward decades. A book came out about the San Francisco Bay Area punk scene of the 1970s and 80s, mostly. And somebody reviewed it and said, I doubt if anybody will actually read the whole thing unless they're searching for their own name. Well, I read the whole thing and I was searching for my own name, but I didn't find it. But I did find something in which I was mentioned, though not by name, but it was exaggerated. So the story in the book was that at the Deaf Club, some guy was pushed off the roof. He was lying on the sidewalk with blood pouring out of his head, and a couple of teenagers came up, and one of them put their fingers in the blood while it was streaming out of his neck. Okay, I think that was about me, but it didn't exactly happen that way. What happened was I went, no couple, just me. I went onto the sidewalk and there was a puddle of blood. Nobody was laying there bleeding, just a puddle. And I was told some guy had attempted suicide. And a cop said, don't anybody touch the blood. So I, of course, walked up and ran my fingers through the blood. And the cop said, don't be stupid. I wrote about that in my diary. Later, a couple of young women I was living with picked it up and read it, and one of them told me, "Oh my God, you were so ahead of your age. You're so advanced for your age." I'm like, now later, I'm like, no, I wasn't. That was pretty typical 16-year-old boy behavior, really. Maybe a little on the outlandish end, but certainly not on the mature end of 16. Yeah. Anyway, all those places happened. I took a lot of drugs in all those places. So let's see. Do I want to tell any other stories? Yes, I do. Um, So people would sell me different drugs and I'd take them. I realized soon that the scene was not to buy drugs and then save them for the right time. That was not the cool way to do things in the punk scene. The cool way was to buy drugs and take them immediately, regardless of what they were. So one time I took barbiturates and just fell asleep. And another time I was there on mushrooms. Another time I was there on acid and something called psychic energizers, which I guess is like Ritalin, but it was just this crude powder. He poured it in, this brown powder. He poured it into my palm and I licked it off, and I was still licking my fingers clean when I was on the bus back home. Okay. Well, one time I was taking somebody sold me a joint. It may or may not have had marijuana in it, but it definitely had angel dust in it. PCP. Never taken it before. And God, have I already told this story on this format? I'm not real sure. Oh well, I'll tell it again. Um I went to this woman and I said, "Hey, you can smoke a joint with me if you want, but I have to tell you it's laced with PCP." And she said, "Sure, let's get fucked up." So then it wound up being me and her friend, female, and another of her friends, I guess, which was a guy. And I'm glad I only smoked a quarter of it, because if I'd tried to smoke that thing alone, God knows what would have happened. As it was, we smoked it, and there was a period of time where I had this feeling of like, um, my mind is not confined to my body. My body is here doing whatever it's doing. My mind is just going out and out and out and out into the universe. Somebody asked me, "Do you know what band is on next?" I said, "I don't know. I don't even know if I'm on the right planet or what planet I'm on." And he said, "Yeah, I can relate." So that happened. And then I was with the four of them, and somehow we all started making out, all four of us. So I made out with, two women and one guy, and I was still pretty effed up. And I think I got a drink or two at some point. And then we started to come down, and the two women had invited me to go home with them, and I'm like, yeah, yeah, okay, I wouldn't mind doing that, sure. And then, but one of them had a broken arm, and I slammed the door on her arm. Ouch, her broken arm. She said, "I don't know if I want to go home with you." And she didn't, and it didn't happen. So that's the perils of drug abuse. You get offered threesomes, and then you do something stupid, and the offer gets retracted. Um, Anyways, yeah, I think I will maybe wrap it up for now, because there's plenty more about the punk scene, but then there's also I go to Japan for a few months in between. So maybe I will save this from this. I don't remember what number I'm on. I will add the number later. But at least I've given you some idea of the chronology. I don't have to make every video a 90-minute video. Okay, thank you. Good night. Bye.